Okay, for those who have gathered so far, I'm guessing some more will be gathering later, but we're glad that each one is here. Jayesh, we're especially happy to see you. My name is Jo Pendleton, and I'm one member of the board of directors for the Migrant Center for Human Rights. The Migrant Center for Human Rights is a nonprofit that's dedicated to improving access to counsel for individuals who can't afford an attorney. We focus on Pearsall Detention Center, located in Pearsall, Texas. Um, it's clear that it's way harder to secure representation while inside detention. And it's way harder to prepare a case for representation. So we're glad to be able to focus our efforts there. We're really pleased to have Professor Jayesh Rathod, who is the director of the uh, Immigrant Justice Clinic at American University. Uh, at the Immigrant Justice Clinic, Professor Rathod and his students uh, do a great deal of work for immigrants, among which is their work with migrant workers. And I was pleased to see that part of what they do is representing vulnerable workers, including day laborers and domestic workers, in recovering unpaid wages for work that's performed. They also represent immigrant victims of labor trafficking, huge problem, in applying for immigration relief. They also represent temporary guest workers on a range of employment law claims and partnerships with nonprofit organizations to advance the interests of temporary guest workers, all of which is just critical issues in these days. So, Jayesh, I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm really delighted to be able to join all of you in this conversation and to talk a little bit about kind of where we are at today with respect to immigrant workers. And if you agree, I think I could maybe just start talking about some of the kind of more general challenges that the immigrant worker community faces, and then how they've been exacerbated by or changed in some ways by the pandemic. As all of us know, in the 1980s, the United States experienced a pretty significant growth in its undocumented population. And this is attributable, this began in the late 80s and kind of really gained steam in the 1990s through most of the 2000s. And it was attributable to a number of factors, including the strength of the US economy, push factors in some of the countries of origin, including difficulties in some of those economies, as well as trade agreements. The North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994 was also a significant force in kind of propelling northward migration to the United States. And as a result of that, really kind of by the mid-2000s, the United States had built up, if you will, kind of an unauthorized population of workers, with a range of anywhere from 9 to 12, 13, 14 million, right? And the numbers are not precisely known. But as we all know, part of what was driving the migration flows have been, and were in the past and continue to be, through the recent past, the availability of employment in the United States and other kinds of economic opportunities. What this has created is a situation where we have a very large group of workers who are unauthorized, but nevertheless are participating actively in the economy. And because of their precarious status, there is a number of ways in which they're kind of susceptible to different kinds of mistreatment. And, those of us who've worked with immigrant workers, and Joe alluded to them, have seen the different ways shape. In the United States, I think that there's no better way to describe it than an epidemic of wage theft that it affects not only immigrant workers, but all kinds of other workers in the service industry and in the low-wage economy. And that's, again, a function in part of immigration status, where some workers are taken advantage of, but also it's partly structural, because there is very little kind of enforcement of wage and hour laws at the state level and at the federal level relative to the number of workers in the workforce. In addition to that, there are significant challenges with health and safety, which is a topic that I've worked on, but also doesn't get a lot of attention. The number of the various ways in which workers find themselves at risk on the job. And also, as Joe mentioned, there's a concern around labor trafficking, which would be a kind of a more severe, more extreme form of labor exploitation, but certainly is one that we see in the United States in different forms. And so those are some of the ways in which the workforce is vulnerable. But I also think it's important, as with any of these conversations, to recognize the agency of the workers themselves, and that although they do have a number of challenges that they face with respect to immigration status and economic security, I think in general the immigrant workforce is very resilient. They're adaptable, they're able to make choices and to advocate for themselves. And many of the positive developments that we've seen, for example, with respect to domestic workers or even foreign guest workers who are come on temporary visas, many of those have been made possible because the workers themselves are organizing and advocating for themselves. So I guess, all of our lives have been transformed by the pandemic, and that certainly is true with respect to the foreign-born population in the US and immigrant workers. And just based on what I've been reading and observing with respect to my own clients, and I'm here in DC, is a couple of things. It really depends on where one is situated in the economy, right? I mean, all of us are experiencing this to determine kind of how you're going to be affected. But as we know, a lot of immigrant workers had been employed in the US in a couple of different industries, construction and restaurant, service, right? And many of those jobs are frozen, right? The work just isn't happening. And so I think now many of those workers are kind of holding on, but I have heard that there's some workers who are making the decision to return to their countries of origin. Others, more or less have established lives here and are more or less consider themselves to be American, if not in formal status, then in the fact that they've lived here for so many years. So they're doing their best under the circumstances. And this becomes challenging because many of them may not, because of the immigration status, have access to benefits, right? And because of that, we're going to be seeing, and I'm already seeing it here in DC, and I'm sure it's true in other parts of the country as well, that you have a whole class of workers who are basically have, they are enmeshed within their communities, but there's nowhere for them to go other than to remain in their communities, and they're not eligible for the kinds of protection like unemployment insurance or unemployment pay rather, or benefits or other kinds of benefits, and therefore it's a very difficult situation for them. And in addition to that, I'll just mention, and I'll pause after this, and happy to take the conversation in whatever direction makes sense, is that the patterns that we're seeing in the US are also being seen in other parts of the world, right? Kind of migration in general, right, is getting frozen, right, because of the health-related concerns. And so a lot of workers who had historically been accustomed to traveling back and forth between countries or regions are now kind of stuck. Some of them may be stuck in host countries. Some of them may be unable to leave their countries of origin. Some of them may be trying to go back to their country of origin. And so we're seeing this play out all over the world, not only here in the United States. So a very uncertain time for immigrant workers.
Okay. Okay. Sarah, Riley. Riley, if you're able to put up on the screen the slide for the workforce in the United States, if you're able to do that.
Yes, let me pull it up really quick. My wife.
Okay, are you able to? Hold on, I'm trying to unmute you.
Oh, sorry, that was my fault. My Wi-Fi is pretty slow right now. I'm working on pulling it up, but as soon as you can keep talking and I'll pull it up on the screen as soon as possible.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Well, just barely. Are you able to put up that slide?
Yes, I'll put it up momentarily. I'm just trying to load it on here. I had to switch devices because of my Wi-Fi. Is it still bad? Can you hear me?
Well, let me just talk about it. Okay, that's all right. That's okay, Riley. It's not coming up, so let me just talk about it a little bit. The slide that we would be showing you shows that 17% of the workforce in the United States is immigrant, is made up of immigrants. And of that 17% of the entire workforce, there are 4 million immigrants who are employed in healthcare and social assistance, no small number. And also in San Antonio alone, just in our city, in 2018, immigrants earned $4.6 billion in San Antonio. And out of that, they paid $1 billion in taxes. $1 billion paid in taxes in San Antonio alone by immigrants. And that left them with $3.6 billion in spending power here, adding to the San Antonio economy. Significant numbers.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I would. I'm glad you mentioned kind of the presence of immigrant workers in the caring professions, as they're called, right? Healthcare and also elder care, domestic work, childcare, which have been impacted in different ways during the pandemic. There are quite a number of persons who are in different kinds of immigration status who are in these caring roles. And so that's quite a challenge. And many of them, because of the challenges with respect to visa issuance, are stuck outside of the United States. Folks are trying to come in on visas, temporary visas, to come work in the healthcare industry. Because of some of the ways in which those processes had been frozen initially, there was some difficulty. Then some exceptions were created to allow them to migrate. But I do think it's important in this time to emphasize how critical in the medical profession, but also in elder care, right? Nursing, we are heavily dependent as a country on foreign-born workers in those spaces. And so we have to make sure that whatever restrictions that are imposed aren't going to be extended to those segments of the workforce, which would then ultimately harm kind of our public health interests.
Okay, I'd like to, can you hear me? Okay. I'd like to refer a bit to the film. uh, for those who were able to see it in the last week, able to revisit that a very old film from 1984, a beautiful film that those of us who are working with immigrants now can hardly keep from comparing it to our situation now. So I'd like to ask Jayesh, if you would, to comment, if you can, on the difference or the similarities between the political situation in Guatemala at the time of the film in 1983 and the political situation in Guatemala and the rest of Central America right now.
Sure. Well, thank you for asking that question. And for everyone who saw the film, I was emailing with Sarah and Joe yesterday or the day before, and I said, I did see this film, but it was, gosh, maybe in the 90s. I might have been in high school or something. And so it had been a while since I've seen the movie, but I remember even at that time back in the day, it having a really strong impact on me. And if you've seen the film, then you know that it portrays some very horrific violence in Guatemala. It describes, well, it describes in particular the experience of indigenous Guatemalans. And as I think everyone on this call must know, that Guatemala experienced a decades-long civil war, is really the best way to describe it, civil conflict, in which many Guatemalans, especially indigenous, poor, and rural Guatemalans, perished. And at its core, the conflict in Guatemala was between the government and what were perceived as kind of left-leaning groups, peasant groups, indigenous groups. And part of why the conflict became so protracted was because Guatemala and other Central American countries became a battleground in the midst of the Cold War. And the internal civil conflict in Guatemala was basically refracted, if you will, onto the overall kind of anti-communist and kind of communism versus the United States tensions that were in existence at the time. And so these groups that were agitating for different kinds of transformations in their societies, groups that were more left-leaning, were accused of or seen as having links with communism. And so it became, and to some extent, in fact, it had become kind of a battleground with respect to some of the values or the tensions that animated the Cold War. That ultimately resolved itself in some fashion, the Guatemalan Civil War, in the 90s, but not before, again, many lives were lost. And what's happening today, I'm not sure if folks are following this current situation in Guatemala. I think those of us who work in immigration know that there is a very significant flow of migrants from Central America because of a number of factors, including organized crime, right? You have a very significant presence of gangs in Central America, especially Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Also, there are a number of other push factors that are kind of interlaced with the organized crime, including the lack of economic opportunities, social and economic insecurity, domestic violence in these countries of origin, limited access to education, etc. That coupled with the fact that in the United States, what we have now is a pretty significant Central American community. Many of the folks who had migrated in the 80s and 90s because of the conflict, and that in a way is acting as almost like a magnetic force for the people who are looking for a place to go. Well, I have a cousin or maybe an uncle or somebody who's already, so why not try for that? So we have for many years now been experiencing very high levels of outward migration from the whole northern triangle of Central America, including Guatemala. And Guatemala, in particular, has been sending significant numbers of indigenous persons. I know many of you are working with immigrants in San Antonio area in Texas, and we're beginning to see this in the detention centers and in the challenges advocates are encountering and working with individuals who are from Central America but simply don't speak very good Spanish. And that poses a number of additional challenges for representation and advocacy. But what's happening today in Guatemala, apart from the general violence and social instability, which I just described, is in ways the country is experiencing a political crisis because of the challenges, well, some of the steps taken by the president. And many of you, well, some of you may be familiar with an entity that the United Nations had established in Guatemala, which is an anti-corruption entity. The initials are CICIG in Spanish, or they're referred to it as the CICIG. It was basically a commission to address impunity and corruption in Guatemala. And last year, to the frustration and anger, frankly, of many, the president of Guatemala basically told the UN that the CICIG was no longer welcome. And as a result of that, there's fear now in Guatemala of even greater impunity, right? The point of this whole commission was, well, Guatemala has an endemic problem around corruption, impunity. We need to put a close watch on that. And but now with the president's decision to expel the CICIG, there's a concern. And this again was, I believe the expulsion happened in early 2019, so almost a year ago. That President Morales, more than a year ago, that President Morales expelled the CICIG. There's a concern that, like, is this a slippery slope into even more impunity, politically motivated retaliation and other forms, perhaps, of violence. So there's a fear that the actions taken by the Morales government are going to be might set the stage for the country to slide back into further conflict, or at a minimum, kind of the type of impunity on the part of the government that was experienced or that was witnessed during the Guatemalan Civil War. So I know many folks who study Latin America and Central America in particular are watching closely what kind of the actions of the government in Guatemala. And of course, we have a situation where during the Trump administration, the US has in general been fairly absent, right, in Central America and in Latin America, with the exception of Venezuela. And so it's unclear what steps the US government would be willing to take, right, should the situation further deteriorate in Guatemala. So certainly a very uncertain time in Guatemala. And, you know, going back to Joe's question, certainly there are some parallels, right, between what was experienced in the 1980s and some of the impunity, certainly not at the same scale at all, but there is concern that it may be heading in a dangerous direction.
Thank you. Let me stop right here and ask if anybody has questions that you'd like to pose to Jayesh at this point. Give me a moment. Okay, well, thinking about the treatment of immigrants in the United States, the treatment of immigrants as workers. That was such a big deal in the third part of the movie. We saw some serious injustice, some comic injustice when due to language problems, but some serious injustice as well. And what do you think of the difference? Is there a difference, a large difference in the difference in the, is there a difference in the treatment of immigrants in the workplace in the United States in 1983 as opposed to 2020?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And you know, what we see in the movie are a couple of different ways in which folks are kind of inserted into the economy as immigrants. There's the kind of day labor scenario that I think is shown in the film. There's kind of construction work. There's also kind of domestic work. And so, you know, as I mentioned, those are definitely parts of, you know, very, very, very common industries for immigrants today. So in some respects, that hasn't changed. Kind of the distribution of immigrants in the job market and the kinds of industries where they tend to dominate continues. And I would say that are even kind of stronger. The kind of polarization, if you will, or the overrepresentation of foreign-born workers in some of these industries. One thing that's interesting to think about. So today, in 2020, and it's been the case now for over 30 years, but as we all know, in the US, at a federal level, it's not, it's against the law to hire somebody who doesn't have authorization to work, right? And so I think for us today, this is like a truism that we just accept. And of course, you know, that's what the law is. You can't just legally hire somebody who doesn't have authorization, right? So I think it's kind of ingrained in our consciousness that that's the fact. But it's interesting to note that that law only was put on the books in 1986. And so before 1986, it wasn't prohibited at the federal level. It wasn't illegal federally to hire somebody who lacked authorization to work. And so I think that's a whole kind of the establishment of that whole regime, if you will, of kind of control over kind of workplace dynamics between employers and immigrant workers is a new feature of, well, new-ish feature of the law. And it's also been one that affects the lives of immigrants, but because it creates this dynamic where they kind of are always in, not only are they in fear generally if they don't have status, of the possibility of removal, right, that they might get apprehended by immigration, but they have this other layer that they have to navigate, which is, you know, the presentation of documents and all of that. And I'm not taking a normative position of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a difference, right, from the early 1980s to the present, where workers have both the immigration control and the workplace control now kind of hanging over their head. The other difference that I'll signal, you know, was mentioned I mentioned it a minute ago, was that the numbers grew really substantially in the 1990s. So of course, we had immigrant workers, you know, we've always had immigrant workers, really, frankly, in the United States for, you know, really since the very beginning of the country's history. But the very explosive growth in the foreign-born population in our recent past happened in the late 80s and the early 90s, through the trade agreements, through kind of the economic boom in the early 2000s, and then it kind of leveled off and declined a little bit after the economy went south in 2008. And so there's just much more in terms of the numbers of the foreign-born population. And what does that mean, right? As a policy matter, it just means it's a more significant issue that the country has to grapple with, and I think we haven't done so successfully. It also means that there's been a lot of advocacy and organizing around this community, which means that there are a number of groups that are working to try to address their needs and to advocate on their behalf, which I think is healthy, right, for the democratic debate. And so we are just in a time where there's these workers are such a significant part of the economy and our society. But as you all know, we're kind of in a situation where we're stuck in terms of some kind of permanent solution. What do we do with the worker population? Do we like, try to find a pathway to legalization? Do we try to open up more temporary opportunities? So we continue to be in a situation where we're trying to find solutions. And I'd be curious to hear from all of you. I think almost maybe most folks on the call are in San Antonio, is that right? Or in Texas. What are you seeing in terms of the day labor population, which was illustrated in the film? What are you guys seeing in terms of reactions, you know, particularly during the current pandemic, right? Because it's easy, and you know, to some extent it's already happened, for there to be some scapegoating or of the immigrant community and say, well, you know, they're taking our jobs, and in this time when the economy is really struggling, right? That folks are saying, well, yeah, maybe it's okay that maybe these jobs that immigrants have traditionally done in agriculture, in the service industry, in fast food, right? Those are jobs that Americans are now happy to take. So I'm just curious kind of what you're observing on the ground. I don't want to kind of jump ahead if we had other questions, but I'm curious to hear what's happening in your part of the world, kind of what folks are saying or observing with respect to immigrant workers in your community.
Joe, I might jump in there that we're about to go to a birthday party of an immigrant worker who is undocumented. Her husband has been doing yard work. Before that, he did construction work. Everything, like you were saying, Jayesh, has got to be under the table. They have 5 kids that are DACA kids in their family and 4 that were born here. So they walk a very tight line. The discussion of having to be deported is big with them, and it's always on their mind of the dad getting picked up while he's driving. They're a super family, but we are very conscious of the parameters that they live under. And we helped another lady here who had lost her green card, was reapplying for it, and she was successful with that. But at the time, she was a house cleaner, or maybe at a motel.
Mm-hmm.
But she was unable to get several paychecks, if I remember right, because she didn't have her papers, and the person who hired her was able to hold that under until she did get her green card. So these are the situations that exist right now. I don't see that COVID has changed anything in our area. Construction work is still done largely by undocumented or green card workers, whether they say it or not. And construction is still going on in Texas. It's, as far as I know, is still booming.
Okay.
But for housekeepers and people working in hotels, that's not booming right now. Restaurants are closed down or working minimally. So those effects are very much prevalent right now.
Thanks for sharing that. It's interesting to hear.
Thank you, Terry.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Terry. Jayesh, did you have a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad. I think that's an interesting snapshot into what's happening in Texas. And I was also going to say that kind of what you're describing, like your initial description of this family that you all are in communication with, that you know, is really emblematic of the fact that more and more we have in the U.S. these mixed status families, right? Where you'll have undocumented parents, you'll have maybe some kids with DACA, you'll have some U.S. citizen kids, you'll have like a whole mix. You might have a U.S. citizen spouse and an undocumented spouse together. And as all of you know, having some, some or significant exposure to this field, there's just no easy pathways, even when you have a long-term presence in the United States and you have US citizen family members and you're basically contributing favorably to the community. It's just not like there's not an easy way to kind of regularize your status. And so that's really unfortunate because these individuals' lives have become stuck in a kind of congressional politics around immigration reform. And so, yes, certainly it makes it very difficult. And I think as all of us know, in working with immigrants, it creates a tremendous amount of uncertainty about the future, right? And so if you have kids that you're raising and you have uncertainty about what your own stability is economically or immigration wise, it becomes very challenging. And I think the perfect example of this is what's happening with DACA, right? DACA beneficiaries who are going to get a decision sometime, I don't know when, but it could be any day now. Many of them, right, the overwhelming majority of them are immigrant workers, right? They're foreign-born individuals technically. They're living in the United States, but they don't have formal immigration status, and they're contributing, like they're working in the economy, right? In all different segments of the economy. And how do you plan for the future, right? When you're not sure what's going to happen.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're about to be cut off. The 40 minutes is just about up, and we're about to be cut off. So I wanted to thank you, Jarish, for your insight and your wisdom. And I want to assure everybody that this is being recorded and it will be posted to Facebook and YouTube, and it'll be sent to our listserv as well. You can sign up for the listserv at www.migrantcenter.org in order to get the recording of this. So thank you all for participating, and thank you so much, Jarish, for your insight and your wisdom.
Thank you.